Marcus Chun had always been the kind of person who left food out for stray cats. His neighbors in the small mining colony of New Terra thought it was foolish. Resources were limited on the frontier world, and every meal packet cost credits they could barely afford. But Marcus couldn't help himself. Growing up on Earth's overcrowded streets had taught him what hunger felt like, and he'd sworn never to let another living creature suffer that way if he could prevent it. The mining station sat on the edge of Kepler, 442b's northern continent, where the red dwarf sun barely provided enough warmth to keep the atmosphere breathable. Most days, the sky hung gray and heavy, casting everything in perpetual twilight. The prefabricated buildings of New Terra looked like metal boxes scattered across the rust-colored landscape, connected by covered walkways that protected colonists from the thin, cold air. Marcus worked the overnight shift in the processing plant, sorting raw minerals that the automated diggers hauled up from the deep mines. It was lonely work, but it paid well enough to send money back to his sister on Earth. More importantly, it gave him time to think. During his breaks, he'd step outside the plant's airlock and look up at the strange constellations that decorated Kepler, 442b's night sky. Sometimes, if the atmosphere or processors were running quiet, he could almost imagine he was camping in the mountains back home instead of standing on an alien world 300 light-years from Earth. 3 weeks ago, he'd started noticing small animals near the waste disposal area behind the processing plant. They looked like a cross between lizards and cats, with 6 legs and smooth, dark scales that reflected the station's security lights. The colonists called them skinks, though Marcus doubted that was their scientific name. They were about the size of house cats, with intelligent yellow eyes and long tails that they used for balance when climbing the metal structures around the station. Most people considered skinks pests. They got into food supplies, chewed through cable insulation, and left droppings in air vents. The colony's administrator had authorized a bounty program, 5 credits for every skink tail brought to the administrative office. But Marcus had watched them for weeks now, and he'd noticed something the others missed. The skinks weren't random pests. They were a family. There were 7 of them, led by a larger female with a distinctive white stripe running down her spine. She had what looked like bite marks on her left foreleg, probably from defending her young against the mining equipment or other predators. 2 smaller skinks, obviously juveniles based on their size and behavior, stayed close to her at all times. The other 4 were slightly larger, perhaps adolescents learning to hunt and forage independently. Marcus had started leaving small portions of his dinner outside the plant's back entrance. Nothing fancy, just pieces of protein bars or dried fruit from his ration packs. At first, the skinks had been too nervous to approach while he was watching. But gradually, they'd grown accustomed to his presence. The mother skink would venture closer each night, her yellow eyes fixed on him with what seemed like cautious curiosity rather than fear. Tonight felt different, though. Marcus had been outside for nearly an hour, and he hadn't seen any of the skinks. That was unusual. They typically showed up within minutes of sunset, drawn by the routine he'd established. He'd even brought extra food tonight, a whole protein bar and some dried vegetables he'd been saving from his ration pack. He was about to head back inside when he heard it, a soft, chittering sound coming from behind the waste containers. It wasn't the normal skink vocalization he'd grown used to. This sounded distressed, almost like crying. Marcus grabbed his portable light and walked carefully toward the sound. The New Terra colony had strict protocols about investigating unusual noises outside the main compound. There were predators on Kepler, 442b, that could easily kill an unprotected human. But the sound was coming from an area he knew well, and something told him this wasn't a threat. He found the mother skink behind the largest waste container, lying on her side in a small depression she'd scraped in the ground. Even with his limited knowledge of alien biology, Marcus could see she was in distress. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, and her normally bright scales had dulled to a sickly gray color. But what caught his attention wasn't the mother's condition. It was what she was protecting. 2 objects laying next to her, each about the size of a chicken egg, but perfectly spherical. They had a metallic sheen that reflected his light in rainbow patterns, like oil on water. As he watched, one of the spheres pulsed with a faint internal glow, as if something alive was moving inside it. Marcus knelt slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. The mother skink's eyes tracked him, but she didn't try to flee. Instead, she made a low, rumbling sound that seemed almost like she was asking for help. "Hey there, girl," Marcus whispered, using the same tone he'd used with stray cats back on Earth. "What V you got there?" He reached slowly toward one of the spheres, and the mother skink surprised him by nudging it closer to his hand with her snout. The sphere was warm to the touch, and he could feel a faint vibration like a heartbeat. Whatever was inside was definitely alive. But as Marcus examined the strange eggs, he realized the mother skink was getting worse. Her breathing had become even more labored, and her eyes were starting to lose focus. He'd seen enough injured animals to recognize the signs. She was dying, probably from complications related to laying these eggs. Okay, he murmured, as much to himself as to the skink. "Let me think." Marcus had no training in xenobiology, but his instincts told him these weren't ordinary skink eggs. The metallic shells, the internal glow, the way the mother had led him to them. Everything suggested these were something special, maybe even something important. The practical part of his mind reminded him that interfering with alien wildlife was against colony regulations. But a stronger part of him, the part that had always fed stray cats despite his neighbor's disapproval, couldn't walk away from a dying mother trying to protect her young. He made his decision. Marcus carefully picked up both spheres, surprised by how light they were despite their size. The mother skink watched him with what he could only interpret as relief. She made one more soft sound, almost like a sigh, and then her eyes closed for the final time. "I'm sorry, girl," Marcus whispered, "but I'll take care of them. I promise." He looked around, realizing he couldn't just carry the eggs back to his quarters. The colony's biosecurity scanners would detect them immediately, and there would be questions he couldn't answer. He needed somewhere safe to keep them while he figured out what they were and what they needed to survive. The processing plant had several storage areas that weren't regularly monitored. Marcus knew the security patrol schedules by heart. There was a 2-hour window every night when the back sections were only checked by automated sensors. If he could find a place with stable temperature and humidity, he might be able to keep the eggs safe until they hatched. He spent the rest of his shift preparing. Using his access codes, he cleared out a small supply closet in the plant's lower level. It was warm enough thanks to the nearby processing equipment, and the ventilation system would keep the air fresh. He brought down water containers, some of his extra blankets, and a portable heater he'd borrowed from the maintenance department. By the time his shift ended, Marcus had created what he hoped was a suitable nursery for whatever was growing inside those mysterious eggs. He'd also done some research using the colony's database, but he'd found no references to skinks producing metallic eggs or showing the kind of protective behavior he'd witnessed. As he settled the eggs into their new home, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just committed himself to something much bigger than caring for a pair of alien animals. The way the mother skink had led him to her eggs, the unusual appearance of the eggs themselves, even the location where he'd found them, none of it felt like coincidence. But he made a promise to a dying creature, and Marcus Chun had never broken a promise in his life. Whatever hatched from these eggs, he'd find a way to take care of them. The eggs pulsed gently in their makeshift nest, their internal glow casting strange shadows on the walls of the storage closet. Marcus checked the temperature readings one more time, made sure the water containers were secure, and headed back to his quarters to get some sleep. He had no way of knowing that in making his simple promise to care for 2 abandoned eggs, he'd just taken the first step toward changing the relationship between humanity and an ancient species that most of the galaxy had given up for dead. The dragons were coming back, and Marcus Chun was about to become their first human guardian in over 1,000 years. As he walked through the quiet corridors of New Terra, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. He'd always been drawn to helping creatures that others ignored or feared. Now, apparently, the universe had decided to trust him with something truly extraordinary. He just hoped he was up to the challenge. The next morning brought new complications. Dr. Sarah Kim, the colony's chief medical officer, stopped by the processing plant during Marcus's shift. She was officially checking on air quality readings, but Marcus could tell she was also investigating reports of unusual animal behavior near the waste disposal area. Henderson mentioned he hadn't seen the skink pack in a couple of days, Dr. Kim said, consulting her tablet as she ran atmospheric scans. The population monitoring program tracks their movement patterns, and there's been a significant deviation from normal behavior. Marcus kept his expression neutral as he continued sorting mineral samples. Maybe they found a better food source somewhere else. Animals adapt, right? Perhaps. Dr. Kim didn't sound convinced. But skinks are territorial. They don't typically abandon established feeding grounds without a compelling reason. The ecological balance on Kepler 442b is more fragile than most people realize. Even small changes in local wildlife behavior can have significant consequences. She paused her scanning and looked directly at Marcus. You work the night shift out here. Have you noticed anything unusual? Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. Just the normal stuff. Skinks rummaging around, equipment cycling on and off. Nothing that seemed important. Dr. Kim nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. Well, if you do notice anything out of the ordinary, please report it immediately. We're still learning about this planet's ecosystem, and we can't afford to miss important changes. After she left, Marcus found himself checking his watch every few minutes. The eggs had been in the storage closet for almost 18 hours now, and he was starting to worry about their condition. What if they needed specific nutrients? What if the temperature wasn't right? What if he'd already failed in his promise to their mother? His break couldn't come soon enough. Marcus made his way to the storage closet, his heart pounding as he entered his access code. The door slid open, revealing the makeshift nest exactly as he'd left it. But the eggs had changed. The metallic sheen was brighter now, and the internal glow had intensified. As Marcus knelt beside them, he could see patterns of light moving beneath their surfaces, like veins of liquid fire. One of the eggs was noticeably warmer than the other, and both were pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. Marcus sat cross-legged next to the nest and watched in fascination. Whatever was happening inside those eggs, it was accelerating. He had a feeling he wouldn't have to wait much longer to discover what he'd committed himself to protecting. That's when he heard the first crack. It came from the smaller of the two eggs, a sharp sound like metal under stress. Marcus leaned closer and saw a thin line appearing on the egg's surface, glowing with the same internal light that had been visible before. The crack widened slowly, and he could see something moving inside. A small, clawed appendage pushed through the opening. Marcus held his breath as the crack expanded, and more of the creature inside became visible. What emerged wasn't anything like the skinks he'd been feeding. This was something else entirely. The first hatchling was about the size of a kitten, with scales that shifted color from deep blue to silver as it moved. It had 4 legs, a long tail, and wings, actual wings like a bat's, but with membrane that seemed to shimmer with its own light. Its head was distinctly reptilian, with large, intelligent eyes that fixed on Marcus with unmistakable awareness. But the most striking feature was its size relative to the egg. The creature was clearly larger than the sphere it had hatched from, which should have been impossible. It was as if the egg had contained more space than its external dimension suggested. The second egg began cracking almost immediately after the first hatchling emerged. Marcus watched in amazement as an identical creature pushed its way out, this one with scales that shifted between green and gold. Both hatchlings shook themselves off and looked around with alert curiosity, showing no signs of the disorientation he'd expected from newborns. Then they looked at him, and Marcus felt a strange sensation like a gentle pressure inside his mind. It wasn't painful or threatening, more like someone knocking softly on a door, asking permission to enter. Without conscious thought, Marcus found himself responding to that mental touch. Images flashed through his mind. The mother skink leading him to the nest, his careful preparation of the storage closet, his promise to protect these creatures. But the images weren't coming from his own memories. They were coming from the hatchlings, who somehow understood exactly what had happened and who he was. Dragons, Marcus whispered, the word escaping him before he could stop it. You're dragons. The larger hatchling tilted its head and made a sound that was part chirp, part purr. Then it spread its tiny wings and launched itself toward Marcus, landing gracefully on his shoulder. The smaller one followed, perching on his other shoulder with surprising grace for a creature that had been alive for less than 10 minutes. Marcus sat perfectly still, afraid to move and disturb them. The dragons, because that's clearly what they were, despite being impossible, settled against his neck like cats seeking warmth. He could feel their rapid heartbeats and the slight vibration of their purring. But he could also feel something else, a connection that went deeper than physical proximity. The dragons weren't just sitting on his shoulders. They were bonding with him, creating some kind of mental link that let him sense their emotions and basic thoughts. They trusted him completely. They saw him as their protector, their family, their guide to understanding this strange world they'd been born into. And despite having no experience with anything like this, Marcus found himself accepting that responsibility without question. He'd promised their mother he'd take care of them, and, apparently, that promise meant more than he'd realized. Marcus carefully stood up, moving slowly to keep from startling his unexpected passengers. The dragons adjusted their grip on his shoulders without difficulty, their small claws finding purchase in his work uniform without scratching his skin. Okay, he said softly. This is new, but we'll figure it out. He had about 20 minutes left on his break, and he needed to use that time to think. Dragons were supposed to be mythological creatures from Earth's ancient stories. They definitely weren't supposed to exist on a frontier mining world 300 light years from home. And they certainly weren't supposed to hatch from eggs laid by six-legged lizard cats. But here they were, perched on his shoulders like exotic pets, radiating contentment and trust through their newfound mental connection. Whatever they were, wherever they'd come from, they were his responsibility now. Marcus began making mental lists of everything he'd need. Food, more suitable living space, some way to hide their existence from the colony's authorities. He had no doubt that if Dr. Kim or Administrator Thompson discovered he was harboring unknown alien creatures, they'd be confiscated immediately for study and research. The thought of losing them to government scientists made his chest tighten with unexpected protectiveness. The dragons seemed to sense his concern. The blue-silver one nuzzled his cheek gently, sending waves of reassurance through their mental link. The green-gold one made soft chirping sounds that somehow conveyed the message that they understood the need for secrecy. You're smart, Marcus realized out loud. A lot smarter than baby animals should be. Both dragons tilted their heads in what looked suspiciously like agreement. Marcus spent the rest of his break setting up better accommodations in the storage closet. He arranged his spare blankets into a more comfortable nest, filled several shallow containers with water, and brought down some of his emergency ration bars to see if the dragons could eat human food. To his surprise, they showed immediate interest in the rations, but seemed to prefer the water. After watching them drink, Marcus noticed they weren't just lapping at the surface like normal animals. They were somehow absorbing the water directly through their scales, a process that left them looking brighter and more energetic. When it was time to return to work, the dragons showed no inclination to leave his shoulders. Marcus tried to encourage them back into their nest, but they clung to his uniform and projected such clear distress through their mental link that he gave up the attempt. I can't take you with me, he explained, though he wasn't sure how much they understood through spoken language versus their psychic connection. People will see you, and that would be bad for all of us. The blue-silver dragon chirped once and then did something that made Marcus's eyes widen in shock. It simply disappeared, not through invisibility or camouflage, but by somehow folding itself out of normal space. One moment it was perched on his shoulder, the next it existed as a warm, familiar presence in his mind without any physical form at all. The green-gold dragon followed suit, leaving Marcus standing alone in the storage closet with only their mental presence to confirm he hadn't imagined the entire experience. Marcus returned to work in a daze, trying to process what he'd witnessed. The dragons remained as mental companions throughout the rest of his shift, occasionally sharing emotions or simple thoughts through their connection. They seemed content to exist in whatever non-physical state they'd adopted, though he could sense their eagerness to return to their material forms. During his lunch break, Marcus retreated to the storage closet and called them back. The dragons materialized on his shoulders as if they'd never left, immediately beginning to explore their physical environment with renewed enthusiasm. They investigated every corner of the small space, tested their wings with short flights, and experimented with their apparent ability to affect the temperature of their immediate surroundings. But the most remarkable discovery came when Marcus offered them pieces of different materials to examine. The dragons showed strong interest in metal samples, particularly those containing rare earth elements. When the blue-silver dragon touched a piece of processed lithium with its snout, the metal began to glow with the same internal light that had characterized their eggs. You could do something with metals, Marcus observed. Some kind of enhancement? Transmutation? Both dragons projected agreement and excitement through their mental link. They began bringing him various objects from around the storage area: screws, wire fragments, pieces of equipment housing, and demonstrating their ability to alter the molecular structure of metallic materials in ways that defied everything Marcus knew about chemistry and physics. As his shift neared its end, Marcus realized he was facing a decision that would determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of human-dragon relations throughout the galaxy. These creatures were clearly intelligent, possibly more so than humans in some ways. They possessed abilities that could revolutionize technology and industry, and for some inexplicable reason, they'd chosen to bond with him. The responsible thing would be to report their existence to the colony authorities and let trained scientists study them. The safe thing would be to find some way to return them to wherever they'd come from and pretend this had never happened. But as the dragons settled against his shoulders, purring softly and radiating trust through their mental connection, Marcus knew he couldn't do either of those things. These weren't specimens to be studied or problems to be solved. They were individuals with their own thoughts and feelings, and they'd chosen him as their guardian. He'd just have to figure out how to be worthy of that choice. The first challenge will be finding them a better place to live. The storage closet was fine for a temporary solution, but dragons, even small ones, needed space to grow and develop. Marcus began planning modifications to his own quarters, ways to create hidden areas where they could exist safely without detection. The second challenge will be feeding them properly. His experiments with various materials suggested they didn't need traditional food, but they clearly required specific elements and compounds to thrive. Marcus made mental notes to research the colony's mineral processing operations and see if he could divert small quantities of the materials they seemed to prefer. But the biggest challenge would be keeping their existence secret while helping them understand human society and technology. The dragons were obviously curious about everything around them, and their abilities to manipulate matter and exist in non-physical forms made them potentially dangerous if they didn't understand the consequences of their actions. As Marcus prepared to take them back to his quarters for the first time, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, he'd been a lonely mining worker who fed stray animals in his spare time. Today, he was the guardian of two impossibly advanced beings who might represent a species humanity had never encountered before. The dragons seemed to sense the weight of his thoughts. Both of them pressed closer to his neck, projecting comfort and determination through their mental link. They understood the challenges ahead as clearly as he did, and they were committed to facing those challenges together. Marcus Chun had always believed that every creature deserved someone who cared about them. Now, he was about to find out just how far he was willing to go to prove that belief. 3 weeks had passed since the dragons hatched, and Marcus's life had become a carefully orchestrated dance of secrecy and adaptation. The creatures he'd privately named Azure and Ember had grown remarkably in that short time. They were now the size of small dogs, with wingspans that stretched nearly 2 meters when fully extended. Their scales had deepened in color and developed intricate patterns that seemed to shift based on their moods and the light around them. More importantly, their intelligence had blossomed in ways that both amazed and occasionally terrified Marcus. They'd learned to understand spoken English within days, though they communicated primarily through their mental link. They could manipulate electronic devices without touching them, apparently by affecting the electromagnetic fields that power the colony's systems. And they demonstrated an unsettling ability to sense things about people that Marcus couldn't detect: emotions, health conditions, even deception. The modified storage room in Marcus's quarters had evolved into an elaborate hidden sanctuary. Using materials he'd gradually accumulated through his work in the processing plant, he'd created a space that looked like something from a fantasy novel. Crystalline formations grown by the dragons from common minerals provided both beauty and function, storing energy and purifying air. Temperature-regulating panels crafted from standard colony equipment kept the environment comfortable, and a complex system of hidden ventilation ensured the room remained undetectable to the colony's atmospheric sensors. But maintaining the secret was becoming increasingly difficult. Marcus called Janet Morrison, his supervisor at the processing plant, as he arrived for his shift. "We need to talk." Marcus felt Azure and Ember shift in their non-physical forms, sensing his spike of anxiety through their mental connection. He'd gotten better at maintaining the dragons in their concealed state for longer periods, but their presence was a constant warm weight in his mind that he'd grown dependent on. Janet led him to her small office overlooking the main processing floor. Through the reinforced windows, Marcus could see the automated systems sorting through the day's mineral extraction, separating valuable elements from common or with mechanical precision. "Your productivity has increased significantly over the past month," Janet said, consulting her tablet. 17% improvement in accuracy, 23% increase in processing speed, and 0 contamination incidents. That's exceptional performance. Marcus tried to look pleased rather than worried. The truth was that Azure and Ember had been helping him work, using their ability to sense the molecular composition of materials to identify valuable deposits that the standard scanners missed. They could also spot potential equipment failures before they occurred, preventing the kind of mechanical problems that usually slowed down operations. "I've been focusing on improving my technique," Marcus said carefully. "Studying the equipment manuals, optimizing my workflow." "That's commendable," Janet replied. "So commendable that Administrator Thompson wants to promote you to shift supervisor. It comes with a significant pay increase and access to restricted areas of the facility." Marcus felt his stomach drop. A promotion meant increased scrutiny, mandatory health screenings, and psychological evaluations that might detect his mental connection with the dragons. It also meant working day shifts, which would severely limit his time with Azure and Ember. "That's unexpected," Marcus said. "I'm honored, but I actually prefer the night shift. The quiet helps me concentrate." Janet frowned. "Marcus, this is a major opportunity. Night shift supervisors are rare, and the position comes with housing upgrades, extended leave privileges, and priority consideration for off-world assignments. Most people would jump at this chance." Before Marcus could respond, the facility's emergency alert system activated. Red lights flashed throughout the building, and automated announcements began broadcasting a general evacuation order. "What the hell?" Janet muttered, checking her communication device. "This isn't a scheduled drill." Through the office windows, Marcus could see workers evacuating the processing floor in orderly lines. But he could also see something else that made his blood run cold. Dr. Sarah Kim and a team of people in environmental suits were setting up sophisticated scanning equipment near the main entrance. Azure's voice whispered in his mind, sharp with concern. They're looking for us. Their machines can detect residual energy signatures from our matter manipulation. Marcus felt Ember's agreement, along with a wave of determination that surprised him. The younger dragon had always been the more cautious of the pair, but now she was projecting fierce protectiveness toward Marcus and an almost aggressive readiness to defend their shared home. I need to get to my quarters, Marcus told Janet. Make sure everything's secure before the evacuation. Marcus, wait, Janet started, but he was already moving. Marcus made his way through the facility's corridors, fighting the urge to run. The evacuation was proceeding calmly, with most personnel assuming this was either a drill or a minor atmospheric leak. But Marcus could see additional security teams taking positions around the building, and he spotted at least 3 people he didn't recognize wearing the uniform of Galactic Colonial Authority inspectors. Someone reported us. Azure confirmed through their mental link. But they don't know exactly what they're looking for yet. We have time. Marcus reached his quarters just as the facility-wide lockdown engaged. Magnetic seals activated on all doors, trapping everyone inside their assigned areas until the emergency was resolved. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a disaster. He was now locked in his room with 2 growing dragons and no way to evacuate if they were discovered. But Azure and Ember had spent weeks learning about human technology, and they'd developed some interesting capabilities. Show me, Marcus said as the dragons materialized in their physical forms. Azure approached the sealed door and placed a foreclaw against the magnetic lock. Marcus watched in fascination as the metal began to glow and reshape itself. Within seconds, the lock had been transformed into something that looked like standard colony hardware, but operated according to entirely different principles. You created a bypass, Marcus realized. Something that looks normal but gives us control. Ember chirped agreement and moved to the room's communication panel. Her touch caused similar changes, creating hidden modifications that would let them monitor security communications without being detected. But their most impressive adaptation was yet to come. We need to hide the sanctuary room, Marcus said. If they scan this area, already done, Azure interrupted, projecting images through their mental link. Marcus looked toward the wall that concealed the dragon's hidden room and saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The wall looked exactly the same, but his enhanced perception through the mental link revealed the truth. The room behind it no longer existed in normal space. Azure and Ember had somehow folded their entire sanctuary into a pocket dimension, accessible only through their unique abilities. That's... Marcus started, then gave up trying to understand the physics involved. That's incredible. The dragons radiated satisfaction at his praise, but their attention was already shifting to the immediate problem. Through the modified communication system, they could hear Dr. Kim coordinating the search. Residual energy signatures are strongest in the residential quarters. Dr. Kim's voice crackled through the speakers. The pattern suggests something has been manipulating matter at the molecular level for an extended period. We're looking at possible alien technology or unknown natural phenomena. Could be equipment malfunction, suggested another voice. Some of the processing units have been running outside normal parameters. Negative, Dr. Kim replied. This is biological in origin. The energy patterns are too complex and adaptive for mechanical systems. We're dealing with something alive. Marcus felt both dragons tense at her words. Azure scales shifted to deeper blue tones, while Embers took on golden highlights that indicated high alertness. Through their mental connection, Marcus could sense them analyzing the sounds coming through the communication system, apparently learning to identify individual humans by their vocal patterns and emotional states. The doctor is very intelligent, Ember observed. She understands more than the others realize. And she's not hostile, Azure added. Curious, but not afraid. We could trust her. Marcus considered this suggestion seriously. Dr. Kim had always struck him as fair and compassionate in their previous interactions. If anyone in the colony might be willing to listen to an impossible story about dragon hatchlings, it would be her. But before he could make that decision, the search took an unexpected turn. "I'm reading massive electromagnetic fluctuations from the main processing plant," announced a new voice through the communicator. "Whatever caused the initial readings, it's active again." Marcus looked at Azure and Ember in confusion. They'd been with him the entire time, and neither had done anything that should have triggered the colony's detection systems. "Not us," Azure confirmed, but her mental voice carried a note of concern that made Marcus's stomach tighten. "Something else," Ember added. "Something bigger." Through their modified access to the colony's communication network, Marcus could hear the search teams redirecting toward the processing plant. But he could also hear something else, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from deep underground, felt more than heard through the facility's structural supports. "Are there others?" Marcus asked his dragons. "Other members of your species?" Both creatures went very still, their minds suddenly shielded in a way Marcus had never experienced before. When they responded, their mental voices carried a weight of ancient memory and profound sadness. "There were many," Azure said finally. "Long ago, before the humans came to this world. But the deep mines disturb their rest. They sleep in the metal-rich caverns," Ember continued, "waiting for the right conditions to wake. Your kindness to our mother was the beginning, but the humans' mining has accelerated everything." Marcus felt a chill of realization. The dragons aren't extinct here. They're dormant. And something about what I did, combined with the mining operations, is waking them up. The vibrations from below increased in intensity, and Marcus could hear structural stress warnings activating throughout the facility. Whatever was happening in the deep mines, it was big enough to affect the entire colony. "The elders are waking," Azure confirmed. "They feel our presence and know the humans have learned to care for dragonkind. They're curious about this development." "Curious how?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Before either dragon could respond, the lights in his quarters flickered and went out. Emergency power activated immediately, bathing everything in red light and shadows. But through the modified communication system, Marcus could hear Dr. Kim's voice cutting through static and interference. "This is not natural phenomena," she was saying. "I'm reading organized intelligence behind these energy patterns. Something is trying to communicate." Marcus made his decision. "We need to help them understand," he told Azure and Ember. "If there are adult dragons down there, and they're trying to make contact, then hiding isn't going to work anymore. Someone needs to bridge the gap between species." Both young dragons projected agreement and determination through their mental link. But they also shared images that made Marcus's breath catch. Memories inherited from their mother, showing vast caverns filled with sleeping forms. Dragons the size of spacecraft who have been waiting centuries for the right time to return to the surface world. "The elders remember when humans were new to space," Azure explained. "They remember both kindness and betrayal from your species. How this first contact proceeds will determine their judgment of humanity. And they will judge based on how humans treat us," Ember added. "We are their representatives now, and you are ours." Marcus understood the weight of responsibility that had just settled on his shoulders. He wasn't just caring for two young dragons anymore. He was potentially serving as humanity's first ambassador to an ancient civilization that had been watching from beneath their feet for decades. The facility's structural vibrations intensified, and Marcus could hear equipment failures cascading throughout the mining complex. Through their mental link, he sensed the dragon's awareness of vast intelligences stirring in the deep places, ancient minds awakening to assess the changed world above them. "Okay," Marcus said, moving toward the modified door controls. "Let's go make history." Azure and Ember shifted back into their non-physical forms, settling into his mind like familiar weights as he prepared to leave the safety of his quarters. But before he could activate the door, his communication panel chimed with an incoming message from Dr. Kim. All personnel, this is Dr. Kim. We're upgrading this situation to first contact protocols. I repeat, we have confirmed alien intelligence attempting communication. All unauthorized personnel are to remain in secure areas until further notice. This is not a drill. Marcus paused, his hand hovering over the door controls. First contact protocols meant the colonial authority would take control of the situation within hours. Military specialists, xenobiology experts, and diplomatic corps representatives would arrive to handle humanity's first documented communication with a non-human intelligence. But they would approach it as a problem to be managed rather than a relationship to be nurtured. And if the adult dragons were judging humanity based on how they treated Azure and Ember, the sterile, cautious approach of official first contact could doom any possibility of cooperation. They don't understand, Azure observed. They think this is about territory or resources. They don't realize this is about family. The elders are listening, Ember added. They're deciding whether humans can be trusted with Dragonkind's future. Marcus activated the door controls and stepped into the corridor. The facility was eerily quiet except for the continuing vibrations from below and the hum of emergency power systems. Red emergency lights cast everything in ominous shadows, and the air carried a strange metallic scent that made his skin tingle. He made his way toward the processing plant, guided by his dragon's ability to sense the electromagnetic disturbances coming from the deep mines. As he walked, Azure and Ember shared more inherited memories. Images of dragons working alongside early human colonists, building impossible structures, and sharing technological knowledge that advanced both species. But they also shared darker memories, betrayals, exploitation, the gradual retreat of dragonkind into hidden places as humans chose fear over friendship. This time can be different, Marcus thought, projecting the sentiment through their mental link. Humans have learned to be better. Some of us, anyway. That's what the elders need to see, Azure agreed. One human who chooses trust over fear, cooperation over control. Marcus reached the entrance to the processing plant and found it sealed by emergency barriers. But the modified security systems Azure and Ember had taught him to create made quick work of the locks. He slipped inside and immediately felt the intensity of the electromagnetic disturbances increase. The main processing floor was empty of people, but filled with impossible sights. Metallic or samples were glowing with internal light, and several pieces of equipment had been transformed into crystalline structures that pulsed with rhythmic energy. The air itself seemed to shimmer with potential, as if reality was becoming more flexible in this space. At the center of the disturbances, a section of the floor had opened to reveal a shaft leading down into the deep mines. The shaft glowed with the same internal light Marcus had seen in the dragon eggs, and he could sense vast presences moving in the darkness below. They're waiting, Ember whispered in his mind, waiting to see if you'll come to them or if you'll call for the others. Marcus looked back toward the facility's main complex, where he knew Dr. Kim and her teams were probably preparing to establish formal contact protocols. He thought about his comfortable, predictable life as a night shift worker who fed stray animals. He thought about the safe choice of turning back and letting trained professionals handle the situation. Then, he thought about the promise he'd made to a dying skink to protect her impossible offspring. Marcus walked to the edge of the glowing shaft and looked down into the depths where ancient dragons waited to judge humanity's worthiness. Azure, Ember, he said aloud, let's go meet your family. The young dragons materialized on his shoulders, their scales bright with excitement and determination. Together, they stepped forward into the light and began their descent into a world where magic and technology intertwined, where ancient wisdom waited to welcome them or reject them based on the contents of one human's heart. Behind them, Dr. Kim's voice echoed through the facility's communication system. Marcus Chun, if you can hear this, please respond. We're detecting massive energy signatures from the processing plant, and We need to know if you're safe. But Marcus was already too far down the shaft to hear her, following a path of light into depths where dragons had slept for centuries, dreaming of the day when humans might prove themselves worthy of friendship once again. The real test was just beginning, and everything humanity's future relationship with an ancient species would depend on what happened in the dragon halls far beneath the surface of New Terra. The descent into the dragon halls took Marcus through layers of planetary history he'd never imagined existed. The glowing shaft passed through solid rock that had been transformed into something resembling crystal corridors, with walls that pulsed gently with stored energy and depicted scenes that seemed to move as he watched. Azure and Ember rode on his shoulders, their mental voices providing commentary on the images that flowed past them like liquid memory. Here, Azure explained as they passed a section showing human ships arriving at Kepler 442b when your people first came to this world. The elders watched from their deep places and debated whether to make contact. They decided to wait, Ember added, to see what kind of species humanity would prove to be, whether you would be gardeners or destroyers. The shaft opened into a vast cavern that defied everything Marcus knew about geology. The space was easily the size of a major city, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above and a floor covered in structures that blended organic curves with technological precision. Everything glowed with soft, internal light that made the cavern feel warm and alive despite being kilometers underground. But it was the inhabitants that took Marcus's breath away. Dragons moved through the cavern with fluid grace, ranging in size from creatures slightly larger than Azure and Ember to massive beings that could have served as living spacecraft. Their scales reflected every color Marcus could imagine and several he couldn't, creating rainbow patterns that shifted as they moved. Some walked on 4 legs, others flew through the vast open spaces, and a few seemed to exist partially in the same non-physical state his young companions could access. All of them were watching him. "Don't be afraid," Azure whispered in his mind. "They're curious, not hostile, but they're also very old, and they remember things about humans that you might not like." Marcus stepped onto the cavern floor, feeling the warm, smooth surface respond to his presence with gentle pulses of light. The nearest dragons approached slowly, their movements deliberate and non-threatening. But Marcus could sense the power in their forms. These were beings who could reshape matter with a thought, who had mastered technologies that humanity barely understood, who had been old when human civilization was young. One of the approaching dragons was larger than the others, with scales that shifted through deep purples and golds. When she spoke, her voice resonated not through sound but directly in Marcus's mind, carrying overtones of ancient authority and careful evaluation. "Welcome, human guardian," the elder dragon said. "I am Celestria, keeper of the deep halls and speaker for this conclave. Your bonded ones have told us much about you, but we would know you through our own senses." Marcus felt a gentle but irresistible mental touch as Celestria examined his thoughts and memories. Unlike his connection with Azure and Ember, this was clearly one-sided. The elder dragon could read him completely while remaining hidden behind barriers of experience and wisdom he couldn't hope to penetrate. But the examination was thorough and fair. Celestria witnessed his childhood on Earth's crowded streets, his decision to leave home for the frontier colonies, his quiet life feeding stray animals, and working night shifts. She saw his first encounter with the dying skink, his promise to care for her offspring, and his growing love for the 2 impossible creatures who had hatched from metallic eggs. Most importantly, she saw his decision to descend into the dragon halls despite his fear, choosing trust over safety because his companions had asked him to. "You are not what we expected," Celestria observed when her examination concluded. "The humans we have observed through your time on this world are driven by acquisition and efficiency. You're driven by something we had thought lost to your species." "What's that?" Marcus asked, speaking aloud in the vast cavern. "Compassion without purpose," Celestria replied. Kindness offered without expectation of return. Your people call it many things, but we know it as the foundation of all civilized behavior. Other dragons began approaching, and Marcus realized they represented different aspects of dragon society. Some are clearly scholars or scientists, their forms surrounded by floating displays of complex data and theoretical models. Others had the bearing of craftspeople or artists, their scales showing patterns that suggested deep aesthetic sensibilities. A few carried themselves with the unmistakable authority of leaders or warriors, though even they projected calm curiosity rather than hostility. We have watched your species with great interest, continued Celestria. Humans expand across the galaxy with remarkable speed, transforming worlds and building civilizations in the span of centuries. But you rarely pause to consider what already exists in the places you claim. Like dragons sleeping beneath mining colonies, Marcus said, understanding dawning in his mind. Precisely. This world has been our sanctuary for longer than your species has possessed written language. We retreated here when the galaxy grew too dangerous for open flight, too hostile for the kind of cooperation that once existed between dragonkind and younger races. Azure and Ember shifted on Marcus's shoulders, and he could sense their eagerness to share their experiences with the Elder Dragons. But Celestria's attention remained focused on Marcus himself. Your bonded ones tell us you offered protection without knowing what they were. You cared for them despite the risk to yourself. You chose to come here despite having no guarantee of safety. These are not the actions we have come to expect from humans. Maybe you've been watching the wrong humans, Marcus suggested. We're not all interested in conquest and exploitation. Some of us just want to help where we can. A ripple of communication passed between the assembled dragons, too fast and complex for Marcus to follow even with his mental connection to Azure and Ember. When it concluded, Celestria's mental voice carried a note of decision. We had planned to remain hidden until your people moved on to other worlds. The deep halls are well concealed, and your mining operations, while disruptive, posed no immediate threat to our security. But the bonding of our young ones to a human guardian changes everything. How so? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Dragon bonds are permanent and absolute, Celestria explained. Azure and Ember cannot exist apart from you, any more than you could exist apart from your own heart. They are bound to your fate, and you to theirs, for as long as any of you live. Marcus felt Azure and Ember pressing closer to him, their mental voices radiating confirmation and contentment. They had chosen him as thoroughly as he had chosen them, creating connections that transcended species boundaries. This means, Celestria continued, that the future of human-dragon relations depends entirely on what happens next. If your people prove worthy of the trust our young ones have placed in them, the galaxy could see an age of cooperation unlike anything in recorded history. If they prove unworthy, the Elder Dragon didn't need to finish that thought. Marcus could imagine what an ancient, technologically advanced species might do if they decided humanity posed a threat to dragonkind. What would it take? Marcus asked. For humans to prove worthy, I mean. Before Celestria could respond, a new presence made itself known in the cavern. The communication systems Marcus had left behind in the processing plant were somehow extending their range into the deep halls, carrying Dr. Kim's voice with perfect clarity. Marcus, if you can hear this, please respond. We've detected massive structural changes in the deep mining levels, and we're reading life signs that don't match any known species. We need to know if you're in immediate danger. The assembled dragons turned their attention toward the source of the transmission, their scales shifting to brighter, more alert patterns. Marcus could sense their interest and evaluation as they listened to the human voice carrying concern for his welfare. She cares about your safety, observed one of the younger dragons, a creature with silver and blue scales similar to Azure's coloring. And she speaks of life signs, not threats or resources, added another. Her first instinct is to protect rather than exploit. Celestria's mental voice carried thoughtful consideration. Perhaps this Dr. Kim represents the kind of human we could work with. But we must be certain before revealing ourselves to your larger society. There's only one way to find out, Marcus said. Let me bring her down here. Let her see what I've seen, learn what I've learned. If she can accept the reality of dragons and the potential for cooperation, then maybe others can too. And if she cannot? Celestria asked. If she responds with fear or greed or the desire to control what she doesn't understand. Marcus considered this question seriously, knowing that his answer could determine the future of both species. Then, we'll deal with that when it happens. But I think you'll be surprised by what humans can accept when they're approached with honesty and respect. The elder dragon was silent for long moments, consulting with her companions through the rapid mental communications Marcus couldn't follow. Finally, she reached a decision. Very well, but we will not risk the safety of the deep halls on the judgment of one human. Dr. Kim will be brought here, but under controlled conditions. If she proves trustworthy, she may serve as a bridge between our species. If not, I understand, Marcus said, and I appreciate the chance you're giving us. The chance is not for humanity as a whole, Celestria clarified. It is for the humans who matter to our bonded young ones. You have earned the right to speak for your species through your actions. Now we will see if others can earn the same privilege. Azure and Ember materialized in their physical forms, spreading their wings and taking flight into the vast cavern space. They were immediately joined by several young dragons of similar size, and Marcus watched in fascination as they engaged in aerial games that seemed part flight training and part joyful reunion. They have missed their own kind, Celestria explained. The bonding with you fulfilled their need for a guardian, but they are still dragons. They require the companionship of their species to develop properly. Will they have to choose? Marcus asked, suddenly worried about the implications. Between their bond with me and their place with other dragons? That remains to be determined, Celestria replied. Much depends on whether your species can learn to coexist with ours. If cooperation is possible, then perhaps dragon guardians could serve as permanent ambassadors between our peoples. If not, the implications hung heavy in the air as Marcus watched his companions playing with their fellow dragons. He could sense their joy at reuniting with their own species, but he could also feel their constant awareness of his presence and emotional state. The bond between them was clearly as strong as Celestria had indicated. Dr. Kim is attempting to trace your location, announced one of the scholar dragons, apparently monitoring the human communication networks. Her search patterns suggest considerable technological sophistication and genuine concern for your welfare. She's a good person, Marcus confirmed. If anyone can handle meeting dragons, it's her. Then, let us test that assertion, Celestria decided. We will guide her to a meeting chamber that poses no risk to the deep halls. You will serve as intermediary, helping her understand what she encounters and evaluating her reactions for our benefit. Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the prospect. In a matter of hours, he was going to facilitate first contact between humanity and dragonkind. The responsibility was overwhelming, but he also knew this was why the universe had led him to those metallic eggs in the first place. Azure and Ember returned from their aerial games, landing gracefully on his shoulders and immediately sharing images of the meeting chamber Celestria had mentioned. It was a smaller space connected to the main cavern by crystalline tunnels, designed to be impressive without revealing the full extent of dragon civilization. Are you ready? Azure asked through their mental link. This is what we were meant to do, Ember added. Bridge the gap between our peoples. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. Let's make history. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Dragons throughout the cavern worked to prepare the meeting chamber, creating displays that would demonstrate their technological capabilities without overwhelming a human newcomer. Celestria and her advisors coached Marcus on diplomatic protocols he'd never imagined he'd need to know. Most importantly, Azure and Ember helped him understand the significance of what was about to occur. This wouldn't just be a meeting between representatives of two species. It would be the first step toward determining whether humanity could take its place alongside other intelligent races as partners rather than conquerors. When Dr. Kim's voice finally echoed through the cavern, announcing that she'd found the entrance to the deep halls, Marcus felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. Everything he'd learned about compassion, trust, and the willingness to help vulnerable creatures had led to this moment. "She's coming," Azure announced, her mental voice tight with nervous excitement. "The elders are watching," Ember added. "Everything depends on what happens next." Marcus stood in the meeting chamber, flanked by his dragon companions and surrounded by wonders that would redefine humanity's understanding of the galaxy. Above them, a lone human scientist was descending into the depths to discover that the universe was far more magical and dangerous than anyone had suspected. The future of two species hung in the balance, and somehow, impossibly, it all started with a man who couldn't resist leaving water for stray animals. As Dr. Kim's footsteps echoed through the crystalline corridors leading to the meeting chamber, Marcus Chun prepared to prove that sometimes the most important revolutions begin with simple acts of kindness.